everybody. My name is Bob. Welcome back to another edition of Geezerology's New Music from Old Friends. Today, we're going to take a look at the newest release from Australian band Midnight Oil. Their 13th studio album was released in February of this year. And the band is currently on an Australian and New Zealand tour in support of that album. And they say this tour is going to be their last. This band dates back to the 1970s, and they've been quoted as saying, that they put on a very energetic stage show, and they want to go out while they're still physically able to, give the fans what they like on stage. They haven't totally ruled out, maybe recording again in the future, but this could, well be the last album from this band. My esteemed partner, Scotty, who's been a longtime follower of Midnight Oil, is going to give you his impressions of this band and their newest round of music. So, Scotty, take it away, brother.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. Resist. This was released on February the 22nd. And I'm just going to start this out by saying that this is an exceptionally strong Midnight Oil album. It's their 13th, going back to their debut. Their self-titled debut was in 1978, and this is their 13th. And they would record through most of their career. Every 2 or 3 years, they would release an album, and then they had a long hiatus in 2000, starting in 2002. And this is the second one since I came back. And Bob touched on that a little bit, but I'll go into a little more detail about the story of this album here in a minute. But I did just want to start out by, I don't want to bury the lead. I want to tell you that this is a great album. It's not going to go down, I don't think, as the strongest album that Midnight Oil ever recorded. But yeah, if this is indeed their final album, which it very well may be, it will go down as one hell of a closing chapter in their legacy. After they went on hiatus in 2002, they got together and did a couple of one-shot reunion concerts, and then did officially get back together in 2017. And but when they did go into the recording studio at the end of this tour in Sydney, Australia, they recorded 20 songs. And 7 of those tracks were written about a movement of the time that to give the Australia's Indigenous people a voice in government. And Midnight Oil has always been an advocate for the Indigenous people of Australia. And so they jumped on this, wrote a few songs about it, recorded 20 songs. 7 of the songs were about this. And those 7 songs, they actually brought in feature artists, Indigenous people, to perform on the tracks with them. And they took those 7 tracks and immediately released that as a 33-minute album called the Makarrata Project. And all the money, all the profits that they made from this album, all the proceeds actually went to organizations that were trying to advance this cause. And at the time, they decided that the rest of the tracks that they recorded, they would do a subsequent album with it. But they wanted to give the Makarrata Project a little room to breathe and get out there in the marketplace forever before stepping on its toes and overshadowing it with this other album. So I decided to wait a while. Well, then 2 things happened after they got these songs in a can, and while they were planning a tour, they were going to release the album in conjunction with this tour that they're now on. But while they were planning this tour, the timing of that, the pandemic happened, so that delayed plans for that tour. And then compounding their problem, tragically, their bass player, Bones Hillman, died in November of 2020, just about a week after the Makarrata Project was released. So everything got put on hold while they regrouped. They went out and found another bass player to take Bones Hillman's spot on the tour, and they finally got it together and went back on tour. And then they announced in November that their new album would be coming out in February, and it did. I don't think I'd get any argument from too many people that uh, that their absolute best albums were from the late '80s. Those albums that broke them in the United States and on an international stage. And that was Diesel and Dust in 1987, and their breakthrough single "Beds Are Burning." And then they followed that one up in 1990 with another behemoth called Blue Sky Mining. And those two records were, I mean, they were a perfect album. I mean, they were just absolutely fabulous. And those two records will always be the standard by which this band will be judged. Resist, as I say, Resist is a great album. It's not in the stratosphere of Diesel and Dust and Blue Sky Mining, but it's pretty close. I mean, they did shoot for the moon with this one, and they got to the moon. They just didn't get to that stratosphere where those other things were. If I were to rank all the Midnight Oil albums, I'm familiar to some degree with every one of the 13. And if I were to rank them, this would be number 3 behind those two gigantic ones that I mentioned. And there wouldn't be any question either way. I mean, there's no question that this is not as good as those two, but there's no question in my mind that this is a better album than anything else that they did besides those two. It's that good. How it falls a little bit short, in my view, is back in those earlier albums, there was Midnight Oil always had, they were always message based. Their principal subject was always concerns about the environment, the indigenous people of Australia, things that were happening. But mostly in the early days, most of their messaging was about things that were happening in Australia. But then after the band dissolved in 2002, they dissolved because Peter Garrett got elected to a governmental position. I think it was Parliament, which is the equivalent of somebody getting to the elected to the House of Representatives here in the United States. But he got elected to Parliament, and then he actually became an appointed official in the Labor Department and also in the Interior Department, or Australia's equivalent of those. And so he had a pretty good advocacy political career going there. And along about 2016, his political career hit a brick wall when this conservative populist movement started spreading across the globe like a virus, and that was pretty much the end of his. So that's when they decided to get the band back together. So now they're coming back with more of a global message than more of an Australian central message. Their messaging is about the environment. It's about the resistance movement. I mean, they even sang about the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. Back in the early days when they were singing about these issues, those albums, there was like the sense of joy and optimism in those earlier albums. Like they were basically calls to action. And they added some verve and some optimism to these things, and sort of putting out this anthemic sound that they had at the time. And how they did that basically were they just had an extensive use of these bouncy background vocals from drummer Rob Hurst and a couple of other band members, and to give these songs a little more of a joyful quality, make them a little bit anthemic. And those background vocals that they used were really effective and getting us geared up for the fight ahead. you know, and that was all. That's what it was all about. Is like, you know, let's put our voices together, let's get our act together, and tackle these problems that we have. But now with Resist, you know, a couple of decades later, and after you know what has been happening in the world for the last 3 or 4 years, there's not quite as much optimism here. We're now hearing that we're now hearing Midnight Oil tell us that, hey, you know, we wasted a whole lot of time in the last 20 years, and we need to get our act together now. And the feeling of that is really enhanced because Peter Garrett now he has this really sneering vocal style that, you know, it's rather accusatory and it's rather sneering, and some of that's taken more of the load on the and the songs here, and it makes this album feel a little more desperate and with a little more sense of urgency. Like I say, you just get this feeling now that that there's this desperation happening. It's like, you know, let's go. We got to do this now. We've screwed up last 20 years. We need to fix this now. There's no more time to waste. It's just it's a darker album because of that. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying that as an observation. I mean, it's appropriately so, a little darker album than those earlier ones. And that what makes it a little bit different. So there's not as much joy here as like there were in those earlier ones, and that's kind of why I think that those earlier albums are better than this one. I have another nitpicky criticism here. This one clocks in at about an hour, and to me, back in the day when for decades when I would listen to albums and digest albums and everything like that, these things were, you know, in the 40-minute range all the time, right? So you kind of get over the decades, you get a little pacing, and your internal body clock, gives you this pacing. It's like, okay, a 20-minute side on an album and a turnover 20-minute side, and the CDs and the CD era basically held on to that. What made it different, the CD era started tacking bonus tracks on the end of what an album was made initially to release on vinyl. But now, in the streaming era, and also taking advantage of the CD era, the proper albums have become longer. It's just a trend. And so this one has gone 60 minutes, and it just feels to me like it's about 10 or 15 minutes too long. There are a couple, 3 tracks on here on the backside of the album that I feel that are probably just as much filler as they are vital material. And if a couple of these tracks would have been excised, I think it would have made it a more concise and more and a more digestible album, because it tends to start dragging through about the middle of the second half of it. There are 4 video singles released ahead of this album. Midnight Oil knew what they were doing in this respect, because all 4 of those singles, along with a 5th track, are the highlights here. The video singles that were released from this album, you can find them all over YouTube, were songs called Rising Seas, Tarkine, At the Time of Writing, and We Resist. And all 4 of those are magnificent tracks, and probably the highlights here. All 4 of those songs were written by Jim Mohini. Peter Garrett, who didn't write too many songs in the early days of the Oils. His songwriting contributions increased a little bit more over time. So, and it's obvious here that he's not quite the accomplished songwriter that Mohini is, because Garrett writes 4 of the tunes in this album, and 3 of those are kind of the tracks that I was mentioning earlier, that they're more filler material than they are real standouts. But I'm going to say that a fourth Garrett tune that he writes, which is the closing track, Last Frontier, is just a magnificent closer for this record. It brings back the old anthemic quality of Midnight Oil songs. He gets Rob Hurst and Bones Hillman and I think a little bit of Mohini singing these rousing background vocals. You know, it's really rousing, but it's ironic because it's really the lyrics in this thing are really a dark song about some guy who's going to have to pack up and go to war and start taking matters into his own hands, so to speak. But as I say, it's the old rallying cry that Midnight Oil used to be really, really good at, and it really closes this album out on a bang. And again, if this is the final album of Midnight Oil's career, and it's closing, and this album closes with this song, Last Frontier, they went out on a rocket ship, man. It's just wonderful. But overall, Resist, it's just classic Midnight Oil. I mean, Midnight Oil is this band, they came out of the sort of the post-punk new wave movement of the late 1970s, and actually during the mid 80s when they were at their peak, and especially in the late 80s when they were in their peak, and the middle 80s when they were just kind of finding their voice and everything, they were sort of on this jangly guitar-based indie rock branch of the tree that also produced people like REM and U2, bands like that. And I think overall Resist it's basically with those few caveats that I mentioned. I mean, this is just classic Midnight Oil, transported from the last half of the 20th century and dropped expertly into the 2020s. This is you know, this isn't just let's get the band back together and toss together a little bit of stuff and put it out there and see what happens. This is impassioned Midnight Oil at their finest, and this is a wonderful album. I would highly recommend listening to this album. It would be a great starting point for Midnight Oil. If it's their last album and it's their closing point, still, you know, for the uninitiated, it would still be a great starting point for this. And if you like this, then you're going to have a whole lot of fun going back and checking out all their older work. It's a relevant album, a relevant messaging. Midnight Oil's always been known for their messaging about sociological and cultural and political issues. This one does not disappoint. It is not to be missed. Thank you, Bob.
Somehow this band escaped my notice, so I never paid any attention to them. And I have to say, I'm the worst for that. And when you told me you wanted to do this, you know, I listened to the album and I was blown away, especially by the opening track, Rising Seas. That yeah, and I went back and listened to some other stuff, and then you sent me another song off of the mining song.
Yeah, the Blue Sky Mine. Yeah,
Blue Sky Mine. Yeah, and wow, that reminded me so much of my grandfather, who was a coal miner and contracted black lung. And I remember, you know, he died when I was very young, but I remember my dad telling me stories about him, you know, dealing with the black lung. So that was just a powerful song. So this is a band I'm going to go back and take a look at. I was really impressed. I'm glad that you turned me on to them. So anyway, great review, Scott. Thank you very much for doing it. You can catch us on YouTube, and we have a whole bunch of other Geezerology things we do. We have our Geezerology roundtable where three of us get together and talk about albums that are impactful to us. We have this series where we take a look at new music, from veteran artists. We also have a free form deal where we talk about books, individual albums, and things that maybe impress us. So anyway, check us out on YouTube. Check out our written blog at Geezerology.com. And thank you very much for tuning in. We hope that you come back and visit us again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.